Unit 6. Immigration. Bound for the United States.
All right, let's get started. U.S. immigration is our topic today. I know many of you are immigrants, so you know something about this topic. As you may know by my last name, I have a German background. My parents immigrated to the U.S. from Germany about 50 years ago. Yes, question.
Does that mean you're an immigrant?
Well, no. My parents are immigrants. They came to the States from Germany. I'm a first-generation German-American because I was born here. First, we'll talk briefly about immigration, the history of immigration to the U.S., and the story of diversity in the U.S. To immigrate means to move from one country to another. It's a permanent move. By contrast, if you go to live and work in France for 2 years, you don't immigrate there. You move there temporarily because you plan to return to your country. So to immigrate means to move to another country to live there indefinitely. Immigration happens all over the world. Most people do it to improve their economic or social situation. What I'll do now is give you a brief chronology of U.S. immigration. Let's start with the colonial period, the first wave of immigrants in the 17th century. Most immigrants were from Western Europe. Although the Spaniards arrived in 1513, the first permanent settlement in North America was one that the British started in 1607 in Jamestown, Virginia. People were not prohibited from immigrating by the British. Anyone could come. Life was difficult, and some people did not survive, but people felt it was worth the risk to have a better life in the colonies. The French, Spanish, and Dutch also came, but in smaller numbers. I should also point out that about 20% of the population at this time was African American. However, most weren't immigrants. They were brought from Africa as slaves. Today, we're limiting our discussion to voluntary immigrants, to people who choose to come to the U.S. Now, by 1775, the U.S. population had grown to about 2.5 million. The country was growing fast. Some thought too fast. So in the 1790s, laws were passed to control immigration for the first time. The Naturalization Act of 1798 required immigrants to live in the U.S. a certain number of years before they became citizens. The second big wave of immigration happened between 1840 and 1920. During this wave, about 37 million people came to the U.S. The Industrial Revolution had begun in Europe, causing a big shift from farming to factory jobs. Many left for the U.S., hoping to continue doing the farming jobs they knew. About 80% of these second-wave immigrants were from all over Europe. During this second wave, Chinese workers also came to the U.S., mostly as contract workers. They arranged or contracted to work for an American company before they left home. Most of them worked in the gold mines of California and later built railroads. Then laws were passed in the 1880s to keep most contract workers out. Now let's see, where are we? 1891. In 1891, the U.S. Congress created the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, to control immigration. Any of you who want to immigrate to the U.S. have heard of the INS. Up until 1891, each state had its own laws and could decide which immigrants could enter, so no one really controlled the total number of people allowed in each year. After 1891, the federal government made the laws instead. A year later, in 1892, the INS opened Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Ships would go past the Statue of Liberty, the symbol of a new life for many people, and stop at Ellis Island. Have any of you seen Ellis Island? Or the Statue of Liberty? You have, Stefan?
Yes, I have. The Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island.
What did you think?
Very impressive. Interesting, too.
Yes, it is interesting now that Ellis Island has been made into a museum. It's an important part of American history. Between 1892 and 1954, when Ellis Island was closed, about 12 million immigrants entered through there, most from Europe. I'd encourage you all to go for a visit. Let's go back for a minute. About 9 million people entered the U.S. between 1900 and 1910. As a result, the U.S. government decided that it needed to limit the number of immigrants. This led to a series of new laws. First, the Immigration Act of 1917 was passed to restrict who could enter. Then in 1921, the U.S. Congress passed a quota system. This meant they decided that a certain number of people from each country could enter the U.S. each year. For example, 2 million from Germany could enter. Once that number had immigrated, no more were allowed until the next year. That's how the quota system worked. During this period, say up until the 1960s, the U.S. was called a melting pot. The attitude was that immigrants had to give up their traditions and cultures in order to create a uniform society. People were expected to forget about being Italian or Chinese. They were expected to learn English and to adjust to American ways of doing things. Now let's look at the third wave, the period from 1965 to the present time. In 1965, the quota system was abolished. Instead, a limit of 290,000 was set on the total number of people who could enter each year. During the 1970s and 1980s, about 80% of the immigrants were from Latin America and Asia, and only 20% were from Europe and elsewhere. So if you compare the second and third waves, you see that in the second wave it was mostly Europeans, and in the third wave it was mostly Latin Americans and Asians. Again, economic opportunity was the main reason people immigrated. Each year after 1965, many people wanted to immigrate to the U.S., many more than the 290,000 limit. This led to the Immigration Act of 1990. The Immigration Act of 1990 raised the yearly limit from 290,000 to 700,000. However, from 1990 to the present, the actual number has been closer to 1 million, one reason for this being that the U.S. needs workers for many of its service jobs, such as in restaurants or hotels or in farming. In recent years, many people in the U.S. have come to realize that the country's greatest strength is the diversity of its people. So the old melting pot ideal has been replaced with the ideal of cultural diversity, with recognizing the importance of Americans' many different cultural backgrounds. You can see this today in strong communities that are Korean American, Japanese American, Italian American, Mexican American, and so on. Any questions about this? Susan?
I'm confused. I thought the melting pot was a good thing, that people should mix together and form a strong society.
Yes, I think you're right. We do want to mix together and form a strong society. But now the metaphor is that we want to have a mixed salad where each ingredient keeps its original flavor, too. Does that sound like a good thing?
Yes, it makes sense.
Well, let's sum up. There were several waves of immigration into the U.S. The earlier waves were mostly Europeans, while the later waves have been mostly people from Latin America and Asia. The main reason has always been economic. They are looking for better jobs and a better life than they had in their home country. In the next class, I'm going to talk about current immigration laws. We'll start there next time. That's all for today.